Okay, in this video I'm going to go over the final assembly for the clock project. And this board might look a little bit different from yours depending on if you're in 117 or 115 or both classes. You might have just the Atmega IC, or you might have this nano board. So I'm going to go over a few of the little last wiring parts, and then we'll show you how the whole assembly goes together. On the back of the board you have this green terminal block that's used to provide the AC power. Now, when you see here AC, most people get a little nervous and think that that's dangerous or you can get a lethal shock from it. This is actually low voltage AC that's coming from the adapter that you're going to use to power the clock. The reason we need to use an AC adapter is because we're using that AC waveform to actually create an interrupt for the 1 second timer. It's actually 60 hertz, so we'll divide that down. But you cannot use a DC adapter with this. So what we need to do is connect the adapter or the DC power jack to these wires, solder them on there, and then plug them into the terminal block. Strip the ends of these wires, leave maybe about, at the most, 1/4 of an inch long length on the end, and then you're going to twist the ends of the wires together at the end so that they don't come out, and slide these into the hole here. Bend it up like that, and then you're going to solder each of these connections, the wires on here. Make sure they're completely covered with solder, but not so much solder that it could short out the terminals. So a well soldered connection should look like that. It should cover up the hole and cover up the wire. Make sure that there aren't any extra loose strands that could touch the other wire. Next, you'll need to strip the other ends of these wires about 1/4 of an inch, and then what we're going to do is insert that into the terminal block. Make sure that you're clamping down just on the wire itself, and then use a screwdriver to clamp down those wires. Now, this is just for testing. When you actually do the assembly, you'll need to actually mount it on this on the hole that's on the base here, so you'll have to disconnect it. That's why we use a terminal block there. So this is 22 gauge wire, so we want to make sure that you're stripping it in the right slot on the wire stripper, and maybe about that long. Now, the main reason that we want to make sure it's not too long, the right length, is that that wire is going to go into the terminal block. Excuse me. So when it's actually pressed in there, that wire, the clamp, when you screw that clamp down, it will screw on the wire but not on the insulation. We want to make sure that the insulation is not being clamped down on, or else it won't make a good connection. Also, we want to make sure that that wire isn't too long. If it's stripped too long, the two wires could short out. So just long enough to go into the hole on the cage clamp. Now for the speaker connection, you've got some blue wire. I'm going to cut that in half and strip the ends. Again, this is going to be 22 gauge wire. So strip the ends. And what we're going to be soldering that to on the board are these pins here on what is called A11P1. That's the actual speaker, SP1. So you'll put that wire on this side and solder it on the back side, right there, and then trim it. And you're going to do that with both wires. And then the other end is going to attach to the little speaker, this little guy here. Now these wires are tiny, tiny gauge. And I'll go over that in a second here. So here are these tiny speaker wires, and I'm going to show you a little trick here. To strip them, the gauge is really small, but this is kind of an old electrician's trick. Rather than solder the wires on at both of these ends here, I'm going to cut one of them shorter than the other. And the reason I'm going to do that is so that when I make the connection to this wire here, there's no chance that it could short out to this wire here. So I'm going to strip those ends and then solder them onto the blue wire. And when I'm done with that, I'm going to run some heat shrink tubing, which is this either, it might be white or different colored tubing. And I'm going to cut this in half. And once I've got that soldered connection done, I can slide this over the insulation. And then you heat it with your soldering iron, and that will shrink it down over the solder connection. So that'll connect to the speaker. So when it's said and done, we're going to have two wires soldered onto the board. Going to have these wires soldered together, and then with the heat shrink going over it after it's soldered to make sure that it's well insulated. So that's as far as the electrical assembly. That's the only other parts you need to do for that. So once you've got all your wiring done, the next thing we're going to do is mount what are called standoffs, which are these plastic spacers that are threaded on one end, female and male, and we're going to mount that male end on the hole here. And these are plastic, so they can cross-thread fairly easily. But what we're going to do is use a nut on that side of the board, put the standoff so it's facing out away from the board like that. We're going to do that with all 4 of these. Okay, now once you have all those standoffs mounted, then that is how we're going to actually mount the front of the clock onto the plexiglass. So you've got 4 longer screws that are going to go on the top through the standoffs to hold that in place. One thing, you might have to loosen up the screws in the back to make sure that all the holes line up. They've got to obviously line up, but you're going to put those 4 screws and that holds the circuit board to the plexiglass front. So don't make the mistake I almost did there where I mounted the clock upside down. The decimal points on the bottom of the display should be facing down on the bottom of the clock. Once that's done, you'll need to use some kind of glue to actually glue the base stands in place. And the way that those mount on there, they attach on the bottom sides. You could use a plexiglass glue. I wouldn't recommend super glue because it tends to kind of fog the plexiglass, and you want it to look nice, of course, when it's done. So let's see what this looks like when it's all assembled. Okay, so this is what the final assembly looks like. It should look like this once it's all glued in place. I don't have my speaker mounted on there, or the jack. The speaker has a little adhesive strip around the inside, and so you can just peel that off and then mount it in front of one of the holes on the side. Okay, so that's the whole rest of the assembly for the clock.